Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Superman is easily among the mightiest superheroes of all time, and with his near godlike powers, DC has often struggled to come up with adequate villains for him to fight. But then, it's only fun when your favorite superhero meets his match, isn't it? While it's not been easy to create fitting adversaries for the Man of Steel, we still have seen quite a few of them over the years. In this video, we'll try to cover every single one of these villains whom he encountered. Some managed to match up to his powers, while some others fell comically short. But this video will not discriminate and will bring you everything there is to know about all of these Superman villains. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
No, I beat you.
Lex Luthor. When we think about Superman villains, one of the first names that comes to mind is that of Lex Luthor, the egotistical, crazy scientist who simply wants to get rid of Superman. His character graph was changed from being a narcissistic mad scientist to the CEO of LexCorp, but his goals remained the same. He loathes the popularity enjoyed by Superman, and since Lex Luthor is such a giant in the list of DC villains, he's also faced off against many other superheroes like Batman. Surprisingly, such a menacing villain doesn't actually have any superpowers. He's reliant on his inventions and planning, where he even teams up with some other familiar antagonists in the DC universe, such as Metallo, Bizarro, and others. He's an expert on all known forms of science, and his intellectual superiority makes him a match for Superman, who obviously outweighs Lex Luthor in terms of raw power. He desperately wants to destroy Superman, and believes that he could create a better life in Superman's absence. There have been several story arcs where he successfully troubled Superman with his schemes or his use of kryptonite weapons. All in all, he's been an entertaining primary enemy of Superman, and over the years, he's been present across comic books, animated series, and even movies. Darkseid. He's not regarded as one of Superman's greatest adversaries for nothing. Darkseid is portrayed as a sadistic and oppressive ruler who lords over Apocalypse, and he aims to control everything and everyone in the universe by means of the anti-life equation. Of course, that puts him at odds against the powerful protector Superman, but make no mistake, Darkseid, being a new god, is no less powerful.
Overdue, Superman.
He's technically immortal, and he survived some major apocalyptic events, such as the destruction of a whole planet. His cosmic powers and incredible strength enabled him to withstand attacks from the entire Justice League, and he even absorbed life force of old gods to strengthen himself further. He has a violent origin story, where he killed his own brother to claim the power of the Omega Force. Later, he became the super powerful entity who wanted to eliminate all forms of free will from the universe. In the extensive DC lore, Darkseid has commanded hordes of superpowered minions, and Superman has often been caught in a tricky situation while trying to fight this near-indestructible force. Doomsday. Not many are aware of the fact that one of the most feared DC villains, Doomsday, actually has a rather tragic and unfortunate origin story. He was a result of twisted experimentation in Krypton by a mysterious alien being named Bertrand, thousands of years before the humanoid Kryptonian race existed. The cruel experiments kept causing his death multiple times, and the remains were cloned to create a stronger version. The repeated deaths got registered in his genes, and eventually he became a monstrous creature with nothing but hate for all forms of life. He would destroy worlds just for fun, and when he turned his focus towards Earth, he meets with his first major resistance, Superman. The two have had numerous run-ins, and there was a famous story arc titled The Death of Superman, where the Man of Steel was apparently killed off while trying to stop Doomsday. You can imagine how tough it must be to defeat a supervillain who keeps coming back from the dead, and his venomous extendable claws made him a deadly opponent. His only major weakness was his inability to think intelligently, because he was wired to hate everything so strongly, and consciousness often took the back seat. Brainiac. Brainiac was actually a techno-organic entity who hailed from the planet Colu. He was in possession of some advanced technology that allowed him to shrink down various regions across the universe to restore his own land. This is how he ended up on Earth, and he began shrinking many cities, including Metropolis. Brainiac also had an Ultra-Force shield, which protected him from all of Superman's attacks, and it required a special sacrifice from the Kryptonians of Kandor to help the Man of Steel save the day. Later, another story arc retold Brainiac's origins and expressed him as a form of artificial intelligence that believed that shrinking down civilizations across the universe was the best way to preserve them. There have been instances where Brainiac teamed up with the other major DC villains, and he has troubled Superman countless times during their duels. Since he has a mechanical body, he's not subject to the usual forms of wear and tear or aging. He stores information like a supercomputer, and his mind can control other forms of technology in the vicinity. He can also take over the bodies of other beings, and Brainiac also has freakish physical strength, enough to knock out Superman with a punch. We've already spoken about his shrinking technology and ability to create an impenetrable force field, and all these make him invulnerable. General Zod. Back in the Silver Age of comic books, when it was not a prerequisite for Superman to be the last surviving Krypton, General Zod had very different origins than what we see today. He was the leader of the military forces on Krypton, who was sentenced to prison for his attempt to take over the planet. Later, after his release, he tried to take over Earth using his powers acquired under the Yellow Sun, and Superman had to put him back in his place. However, in later stories, General Zod had multiple story arcs trying to explain his origins, and a memorable backstory had him come from a pocket universe. He even destroyed the Earth in this universe, and the survivors appealed to Superman for help. There was also a Russian Zod who was exposed to kryptonite radiation and then was raised in a KGB lab. Even though the origin stories around him kept changing, one thing was always constant: his hate for the Man of Steel. General Zod was just as strong as Superman, making their rivalry remarkable, and with powers like heat vision, freeze breath, rapid healing, and many others, he could match the strongest man on Earth blow for blow. The statement, "Kneel before Zod," still brings back some terrifying memories for the Superman fans. Bizarro. Just like many other prominent Superman villains, the origin stories of Bizarro have been altered time and again. When General Zod created an army to take over Krypton, he developed Bizarro duplicates of himself, which were termed Bizarros. These soldiers were a force to reckon with, even without any superpowers, because they were determined to kill or get killed for General Zod. Later, a scientist on Earth ended up duplicating Superboy, and this copy was termed Bizarro. He was rejected by the people for being somewhat freakish, and eventually Superboy had to destroy this defective clone. Many years after this event, Lex Luthor used the technology to create a duplicate of Superman, and all hell broke loose when he wreaked havoc on the city. Superman later encountered a Bizarro with his exact opposite powers, and this supervillain took on the entire Justice League on various occasions. The two had some memorable fights over the years, and the mouth-watering contest became so interesting because the powers of Bizarro were in many ways identical to that of Superman. They were evenly matched, and Bizarro teaming up with other supervillains always spelled trouble for the Man of Steel. Parasite. There are multiple versions of Parasite that we've seen over the years, but the powers and abilities have almost always remained the same. Every version of Parasite could absorb the life force, knowledge, and powers of the victim, and this probably led to the unique name. Rudy Jones is perhaps the most notable Parasite among all these versions, and he's the notorious Superman villain that we saw being adapted in the animated and live-action universe as well. The first Parasite was a man named Raymond Maxwell Jensen, who had a rather tragic storyline where he could absorb some of Superman's powers, but it also meant that he could no longer hug his wife or children. This version of Parasite even knew about the secret alter ego of Superman and often launched his attacks on Clark Kent. Rudy Jones was actually manipulated by Darkseid and got exposed to some strange radiation that turned him into a villainous version of himself. He could absorb the life force from his victims, and Rudy Jones had some memorable run-ins with Superman. However, he didn't retain the powers that he absorbed forever, and he had to constantly look out for new victims. There were a couple of other Parasite versions, but the two above-mentioned variants are the ones that were most utilized in adaptations. We have to admit that given the powers of Parasite, he ought to have troubled Superman more than he did. Metallo. Superman was so incredibly powerful that the creators needed something just to make him vulnerable enough and make his fights with supervillains interesting. This introduced the whole weakness to kryptonite story arc, and most notable Superman villains will have used this tactic. Metallo was not an exception, and this evil cyborg had a kryptonite source in his heart, which could trouble Superman during their encounters. Just like Parasite, there have been various versions of Metallo, and one of the first ones was an evil scientist named George Grant, who developed powerful armor and a super strength strength serum to make himself a match for Superman. Later, a journalist named John Corbin was turned into Metallo by a scientist after John encountered a near-fatal accident. His origins were changed in another story arc where John Corbin was portrayed as a small-time thug who was manipulated by an expert of robotics after he suffered a similar accident as in the previous storyline. Since Metallo has an extremely strong armor for his body, most attacks are nullified immediately. He got several enhanced upgrades in the course of time, including the Lex Core tech body that enabled him with laser vision and increased strength. Being powered by Kryptonite meant that Superman already had to deal with a familiar weakness, and his battles with Metallo were memorable events for the fans. Mongol had a dramatic introduction in the Bronze Age when he kidnaps all of Superman's friends, including the likes of Lois Lane, Steve Lombard, and Jimmy Olsen. He blackmailed the superhero to bring the key to activate the planet of Warworld, and this even led him into a conflict with Martian Manhunter, who was protecting the key. Mongol actually managed to activate the Warworld, but the immense strain caused by it knocked him unconscious. Finally, the superheroes managed to destroy the Warworld to set things right. Later, Mongol conquered the home planet of Prince Gavin, Throne World, and used its unique ability to destroy planets to blackmail several other planets into submission. Once again, Superman had to save the day following an intense battle with Mongol for the fate of the universe. Since then, their rivalry has been iconic, and there have been numerous face-offs between the two. During these fights, there have often been times when Mongol was clearly more powerful than Superman. Especially in hand-to-hand combat, Mongol held the edge more often than not, and the supervillain had some invincible powers, such as teleportation, telekinesis, and also the technology to shrink his enemies. The Bronze Age Mongol was stronger than his modern age version, but he could still withstand Superman's attacks with relative ease. But you know what they say, the stronger the villain, the more entertaining the contest. Toyman. There have been 3 different versions of Toyman that the fans have witnessed, but the most well-known incarnation of him is a criminal named Winslow Percival Schott. He used several devices based on simple toys, but these devices often proved to be extremely lethal. Initially, he was viewed as more of a nuisance, but with time, the character demanded to be taken more seriously. He was emotionally unstable, and his devices started to become more and more dangerous. This version of Toyman had 2 distinct personalities, one of a regular civilian and the other of a maniac. However, after he retired from his life of crime, he often helped Superman in dealing with Jack Nimble, the man who took up the Toyman mantle after him. Bizarro's conspiracy led him into thinking Superman was his true enemy, and he went back to his life of crime. Finally, when he came to his senses, he was devastated at what he had done, but it was too late to repent. Another origin story of Toyman depicts him as an unemployed toy maker, who often crosses paths with the likes of Superman. This supervillain did not have any unique powers, but his technological power allowed him to develop some deadly weapons. While Toyman did commit some serious crimes and fought the Man of Steel on several occasions, he was basically a victim of circumstances and not truly evil. Mr. Mxyzptlk. This mysterious deity possessed a bag full of tricks which he used to torment Superman on countless occasions. He was also called Mix, and he had the ability to alter reality, and there have been various portrayals of this character, ranging from being truly evil to an annoying anti-hero. Initially, Mix was shown to have one major weakness: he could be sent back to the 5th dimension by tricking him into saying his name backwards. As difficult to pronounce as his name is, you can't really blame him for losing his mind over this. With time, this condition was modified in various stories, but it still mostly involved Superman having to do something to outsmart him and send him back. He possessed incredible magical powers, and Mix was not bound by the general laws of physics. He mostly comes across as a prankster, someone who simply enjoys causing trouble for Superman as means of his entertainment. He could have been Superman's deadliest adversary had it not been for his gullible and fun-loving character. On most occasions, Superman simply had to trick him into doing something silly that would push him back to his own realm. He may not have been a major threat to Superman, but he still ranks as one of the most memorable Superman villains because of his quirks. The Elite. The only thing better than Superman fighting a powerful villain is him fighting an entire team. The Elite is a team of misfits, a group of anti-heroes who get together and take on Superman. They initially tend to fight crime using brutal and violent methods, but later their intentions take a darker turn, and they don't hesitate to fight Superman when opposed. Manchester Black is the leader of the team, and he has the gift of telekinetic powers. He eventually realizes that he's become like the very supervillains he meant to fight. but it's a bit too late. The Elite has a muscular man named Coldcast who can manipulate electromagnetism, and Vera Black is a psionic cyborg who also happens to be Manchester Black's sister. The other members include Menagerie, who wears an armored suit and transforms into a deadly creature, and the Hat, who has the ability to breathe fire. As you can imagine, fighting such a group of superhumans is a task only suitable for someone like Superman, and you can watch a lot of their mouth-watering contests in the animated movie Superman vs. the Elite. Superman Prime. He also goes by the name Superboy Prime, and he's been a constant nemesis for Superman in multiple story arcs. Interestingly, he used to be a superhero initially who turned rogue and became an alternate evil version of Superman. He hailed from an alternate Earth called Earth Prime, and during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earth, he got stuck in a paradise dimension after his universe was erased. He was used to being a superhero in his universe, and he continued with his ambitions, only he was slowly turning into a psychotic and dangerous supervillain. Superman Prime had similar powers as Superman himself, and he had the same degree of superhuman strength and speed that made him a deadly adversary for the Man of Steel. He also had the ability to use heat vision, and his freezing breath was an innovation that often stumped Superman. In some story arcs, he's been shown to have the power of altering realities, and such a powerful character gone rogue posed some genuine challenges for Superman. He's been around for over 85,000 years, and he's projected as one of the most powerful DC characters of all time. He certainly had the potential to become one of the greatest Superman villains, but somehow the focus always remained on some of the other guys.
And... nah. Mess with the main man.
Lobo. Lobo is an alien mercenary who works all over the universe for his contracts. This bounty hunter was introduced on a lighter note and was intended for parodies. However, his appearance in Justice League International got a lot of love from the fans, and the writers started to take him more seriously. Lobo even got a new origin story after that, where he was said to be the last surviving Karzanian who had killed every other member of the species. Even though he's a heartless killer, he does abide by his own code of honor. In all his interactions with Superman, he's been both the aggressor and the helper. He's also fought the likes of Aquaman, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, and various other notable superheroes. His strength and powers are incredible, and there have been instances where he proved to match the Man of Steel blow for blow. He also has accelerated healing that makes him a tough fighter, and there has been a story arc where he was shown to be able to clone himself successfully. Overall, a deadly combatant who would do just about anything to finish his contract killings, just the kind of guy you would want Superman to deal with. Ultraman. There have been several versions of Ultraman, but they had a lot in common. They were all evil versions of Superman from alternate universes, and they appear to be an exact replica of the world's strongest superhero. The first Ultraman we were introduced to was the Earth 3 Ultraman, who kept getting stronger every time he got exposed to kryptonite. He could see through dimensions, and he was basically a version of Superman without his weaknesses. He even teamed up with Lex Luthor to plan on eliminating Superman, and later, he found alliances in various other supervillains who intended to take down the Man of Steel. After the death of this particular Ultraman, there emerges another psychotic version to take up the mantle. Ultraman was often involved with the crime syndicate, and it's somewhat unfortunate that DC never did more with these storylines. All Ultraman versions, as we've already discussed, enjoyed the powers of Superman, and some even braved the kryptonite radiation. One version, however, shows Ultraman to be vulnerable before blue kryptonite from his Earth. These really had the potential to become one of his greatest villains of all time, but fell short because of the lack of interest from the fans. Solomon Grundy. What happens when you bring back a murder victim in a zombified form? Well, you end up getting someone like Solomon Grundy, the deadly supervillain and anti-hero. There have been other versions to this intriguing character, but his rivalry with Superman is what brings him into our list. He used to be a rich businessman who was murdered and dumped in the swamps of Gotham City. Several years later, the corpse was brought back to life, and the new creation had no memories from his past. He took up the name Solomon Grundy, and he soon takes to criminal activities. He fought several superheroes, including the likes of Green Lantern and Wonder Woman, and his clash against Superman proved that he was a bit too powerful for the superhero to handle. The Man of Steel takes him off to an inhospitable alien land to put an end to him, but the zombified Solomon comes back several times to trouble the superhero. In one of the story arcs, he's manipulated by Gorilla Grodd to fight both Batman and Superman, and he's been a very interesting character in the DC universe. Besides his freakish strength and brute force, Solomon Grundy is almost immortal and is resistant to most of the attacks from the familiar superheroes. Among the very few supervillains who could actually kill Superman, Solomon Grundy has to be among the top of the charts. Calibac. This legendary warrior was the son of Darkseid and Suli, and he has often served as the second-in-command for his father. And he had a strong rivalry with Orion, his stepbrother, who he felt was preferred over him by his father. Calibac even got killed by Infinity Man on one occasion, but he was brought back with a new Tiger Man body. He also commanded a force of Tiger warriors, and his comeback was stronger than ever. He had limited confrontations with Superman, but their fights were always eventful, suggesting that Calibac was no less powerful than his father. He possessed a powerful Psi Beam. Apart from his superhuman strength and ability to heal from the worst of injuries, he also wielded the deadly Beta Club, which could fire energy blasts strong enough to affect Apocalypsean new gods. He's been proven to be extremely ruthless and sadistic, which probably earned him the title of Calibac the Cruel. While he wasn't exactly a direct enemy of Superman, their clashes became memorable because they were always evenly matched.
So small. All of you.
Amazo. When Amazo was first created as a Superman villain, little did the fans know that he would go on to become one of the deadliest. An evil scientist named Professor Ivo created this android and provided him with a unique ability. Amazo could replicate the powers of the superheroes who clashed with him, and this enabled him to fight them off. He even had the power of mimicking their weapons and use it against them, and this made him just as strong as anyone who challenged him. At various stages in his story arc, he managed to gain the powers of all notable DC superheroes, including Wonder Woman, Flash, Martian Manhunter, and Green Lantern. He proved to be a tough opponent for Superman as well, and the entire Justice League had to work together to defeat him every time. However, while Amazo mimicked the powers of the superheroes, he also ended up acquiring their weaknesses, and this often resulted in his downfall. For instance, if he duplicated Superman's powers, he also became vulnerable to Kryptonite and could be dealt with accordingly. Even with this weakness, Amazo turned out to be a fitting opponent for the Man of Steel, and the fans enjoyed their mouth-watering contests time and again. Livewire. Livewire, aka Leslie Willis, turned from being a radio jockey who loved mocking Superman to a deadly supervillain. She enjoyed launching scathing verbal attacks on the superhero during her broadcasts, and while hosting a rock concert, she was struck by lightning. Superman tried to save her, but she got electrocuted and her appearance was altered. She later woke up and read some false news about Superman being responsible for her condition, and all her previous grudges against the superhero became extreme. She soon found out that the accident enabled her to control electricity, and she used her powers to fight Superman, taking up the name Livewire. Superman got the better of her by drowning her in water at a hydroelectric dam. But Lex Luthor came to her rescue and became an ally simply for their common goal, the elimination of Superman. He was shown to be composed entirely of electricity following the accident. She manipulated electric and magnetic fields and used them to attack Superman. Livewire was also capable of destroying any electrical installation or causing them to malfunction, and she often used this ability to her advantage. While she was not a supervillain of the magnitude of Darkseid, she surely had her moments during her fights with the Man of Steel. Manchester Black. If only we had $1 for every time an anti-hero turned into a supervillain. Manchester Black followed the typical DC trajectory, starting off as a violent vigilante and later turning into a menace. He hailed from Manchester in England, had a thick English accent, and his ruthless nature came from his harsh childhood, where he was abused by his parents. He developed telekinetic powers, and he could also control minds telepathically. He hated all superheroes who turned over the criminals to the law instead of killing them, and this eventually turned him into a vicious killer himself. Superman, as we all know, opposed such extreme violence, and this brought him to loggerheads with Manchester Black. He was able to use his superpowers to make Superman suffer from a stroke, but the Man of Steel was able to use his X-ray vision and heat vision to damage the source of black superpowers inside his brain. He became a part of Suicide Squad during one of the missions, and later, he ended up being manipulated by several other supervillains. You may not think of Manchester Black as a genuine threat to Superman, but he did overpower the superhero on a few occasions. Granny Goodness. The story of Granny Goodness as a villain is one of a meteoric rise. She started off as one of the lowly, oppressed residents of Apocalypse, and from a very young age she was trained to be one of Darkseid's elite fighters. She trained along with her pet dog Mercy, and during the final stage of the training, she was asked to kill her dog by her trainer. Instead, she chose to kill the trainer, and she explained to Darkseid that her actions were simply because Mercy would be a loyal, valuable servant of the Dark Lord. In order to test her claims, Darkseid ordered Mercy to kill her, and she was forced to kill the dog in retaliation. However, the whole thing impressed Darkseid and made him believe in her abilities. He put her in charge of the training facilities and wanted her to create more loyal soldiers like herself for his force. From this moment, Granny Goodness used to torture and brainwash young minds and turn them to be loyal servants of Darkseid. She had very few interactions with Superman, but their fights were interactions because she was no less powerful than the Man of Steel. She possessed superhuman strength and was virtually immortal and invulnerable. She had access to some high-grade weaponry, and all the years of training meant that she could be quite lethal using them. You might not view her as a predominant Superman villain, but watch out for their duels if you want some unadulterated entertainment. The AntiMonitor. The history of AntiMonitor goes back to the beginning of parallel universes, when both the positive matter multiverse and the antimatter universe came into existence. This is when AntiMonitor was created, a monstrous entity with a humanoid appearance. His empty eye sockets are luminous at times, and his body is basically composed of pure energy, which is protected by a powerful armor. When he was faced with Superman, the Man of Steel faced certain death, but the heroic sacrifice of Supergirl saved his life. AntiMonitor had the ability to drain his enemies of their powers, and after his destruction, even his remains were used by Alexander Luthor. There are various instances when Superman finds it tough going against such a powerful opponent, and the AntiMonitor even teamed up with Cyborg Superman on one occasion. He's described as one of the deadliest forces encountered by DC heroes, and he's destroyed universes at will. Besides his reality warping powers, the AntiMonitor also commanded shadow demons and used supreme technology for his purposes. His energy absorbing abilities made some of his opponents helpless, and he could manipulate energy at will. While he was not exactly immortal, theoretically it was impossible to destroy the AntiMonitor as long as the antimatter universe existed. Those who claim that Superman is far too superior and hardly ever meets his match should check out AntiMonitor and how vulnerable Superman becomes when faced with him.
Now who the hell are you?
I'm Superman.
Cyborg Superman. Cyborg Superman was initially an astronaut named Hank Henshaw, and he was stuck in a doomed NASA space shuttle. A failed experiment resulted in the crash of their shuttle, and his physical body was destroyed. His mind, however, was preserved, and the cosmic radiation around him allowed him to create a new body. His wife was also in the shuttle with him, along with a couple of other crew members, and they all suffered the same fate. Back on Earth, Hank Henshaw fought Superman with his newfound powers, but eventually when his wife starts to fade away into an alternate dimension, it is Superman who helps him save her. He then gets rid of his metallic body and gets a new frame for himself from LexCorp. However, his wife is too shocked to see him in this bizarre form, and she jumps to her death. He grows bitter once again, and he's led into thinking that Superman was the one responsible for all his tragedies in the first place. When he learns about Superman's apparent death during the Battle of Doomsday, he poses as the Man of Steel himself with the intention of destroying his reputation permanently. He constructs a similar body to pose as Superman and becomes the Cyborg Superman, wreaking havoc all around. Of course, Superman has the last laugh, but Cyborg Superman continues to haunt him during their multiple duels in the future. This deadly supervillain is capable of physically manipulating technology using his mind, and he could transform his consciousness into a machine, which basically made him indestructible. With such a concrete origin story and such extreme powers, he's easily one of the finest Superman villains that you'll come across.
Welcome to the Hall of Doom. I'm Vandal Savage.
Vandal Savage. Most major superheroes and supervillains have an interesting storyline explaining how they acquired their superpowers. Vandal Savage, however, probably has the most unique origin story, where he got his powers of accelerated healing and immortality after coming into contact with a meteorite. He has existed for over 50,000 years, and he gets his name because of his brutal methods as a conqueror. While his methods might be savage-like, he has a great command over technology and various sciences. Vandal Savage uses this knowledge for his evil purposes weaknesses, and he's proved his worth as a recurring villain for the Justice League. He looks truly menacing, with his pointed demonic ears, and his muscular body hints at the raw power that he possesses. During one of his fights with Superman, he manages to drain the Man of Steel of all of his powers by infecting him with a radiation. Luckily for Superman, he manages to find a cure and fights back, eventually getting the better of him. Vandal Savage is an expert when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, and he can use just about any weapon. His immortality has been played around in various story arcs, some making him absolutely indestructible, while others asserting him as a mortal. His blood could be used to provide superhuman powers to an individual, but the nature of the abilities acquired would be extremely unpredictable. Vandal Savage was not solely a Superman villain, and their fights have been rather limited, but whenever it came to blows between them, the contest was worth the wait.
Frighten you to the great darkness. I will bathe in your fear.
Steppenwolf. He's one of the new gods, and this powerful general from Apocalypse has ensured some tough contests for Superman. Steppenwolf happens to be the maternal uncle of Darkseid, and he has the command of Darkseid's demonic army in numerous battles. He is a hardened soldier, a Doomsday survivor, much of whose story is told through flashbacks in the comic books. He saved Darkseid's life, proving his loyalty for the Dark Lord. During one of the battles on Earth 2, Steppenwolf leads the force of Darkseid and takes on the protectors like Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman, killing them all. In this story arc, he gets killed by Bizarro, whom he had recruited himself back in the day. Steppenwolf is near immortal, and his immense strength has been proven to be enough to keep Superman at bay. He's invulnerable to most deadly attacks, and as a skilled tactician, he leads the forces like a true commander. He leads the charge for the notorious Hound Cavalry, and he can use just about any weapon that you can think of. Our only regret is that he didn't have a one-on-one face-off against Superman too many times, because that would have been a fight to watch out for. Silver Banshee. Whatever little we've seen of Silver Banshee in the comic books, it's usually been as an opponent of Superman, and hence we find it fitting to bring her into this list. Silver Banshee was born to a man named Garrett McDougal, who was the leader of a clan that owned a lot of land. She was called Siobhan McDougal, and her life changed after her uncle challenged her claim to be the next leader after her father. She sought the help of supernatural powers, but an interruption got her sucked into an infernal netherworld. She came back as Silver Banshee and became a ruthless killer who eventually encountered Superman. The Man of Steel was able to get the better of her during their first fight, but she kept coming back again and again. She had a psychotic personality, and everything about her attacks and behavior were unpredictable in nature. Her greatest weapon was not her extreme strength or magical abilities, but her supersonic scream called the Death Wail. This could kill anyone who heard it, as long as she knew their full name. Silver Banshee may not be among the deadliest Superman villains, but she's certainly one of the most memorable ones.
I do what I do, you do what you do.
Atomic Skull. Not everyone wearing a cape is a superhero, and we couldn't possibly bring you a better example than Atomic Skull. He started off as a man named Albert Michaels, who was the administrator of Star Labs. He had a strange neurological problem that caused painful seizures, and in desperation to find a cure, he ended up reaching out to a criminal organization. Here, a radium-powered device was implanted in his body, and while this eased the pain, he had to work for them in return. However, his condition continued to deteriorate further, and he blamed Superman for his miseries, because the superhero was involved in the capture of those in the criminal organization who could potentially cure him. This is when he took up the mantle of Atomic Skull, dressed up in his creepy green costume and skull mask, and vowed to destroy Superman. He could launch powerful energy attacks and even blasts of atomic energy. Atomic Skull also had immense scientific knowledge, and eventually he went on to lead the criminal organization. Purely in terms of strength, Superman has faced far superior enemies, but you simply cannot discount the uniqueness of this particular supervillain. Eclipso. Combine the Wrath of God and the Angel of Vengeance, and you'll end up with something as demented as Eclipso. Well, it was not like this from the beginning, when he was created as just another generic character. However, things changed pretty quickly and stories started to take a darker turn. He was portrayed as this evil, megalomaniacal entity who wanted to possess the extreme powers of individuals like Superman. He used various hosts during his endeavors, and one of his first hosts happened to be a scientist named Bruce Gordon. In a later story arc, he was introduced as a vengeance demon, and he possessed several of the Earth's finest superheroes and transported them to the moon during an eclipse. He absorbed their powers and rendered them helpless, before Will Payton saved the day by destroying the moon. Eclipso fought Superman on countless occasions, and each encounter was marked by just how powerful the supervillain was for the Man of Steel. It required an extraordinary move from Superman to defeat Eclipso because he was immortal and possessed unimaginable powers. His eyes could emit dark light, which was so powerful that it could paralyze and kill the victim. He also had godlike magical powers and reality-bending abilities, and the story surrounding him would tell you that he's not one to mess with. El was a Kryptonian survivor with a rather tragic origin story. He was a clone who had no idea about his true existence because he was created such that he would believe himself to be naturally born. He was brought up and trained to hate clones without any knowledge of his own self. He wasn't originally a Superman villain, and he actually wanted the superhero to help him in restoring Krypton. However, Superman did not believe his purpose, and it led to an enmity of grand proportions. El planned to extinguish the Earth's sun in order to restore Krypton, and his mission brought him in direct conflict with Superman. It was Supergirl who managed to trick him into thinking that she'd sided with him, and he was eventually defeated after being stabbed with a piece of kryptonite. This attack sent him back in time, and he also learned the truth about his origins. Now, his goal was to conquer Krypton, which existed in his time. Once again, Superman was summoned to stop him, and El was finally trapped in a time loop where he spent his days in an eternal limbo. Since he was a clone, El could endure the radiation of kryptonite, and he had numerous superpowers such as telekinesis, teleportation, and his ability to alter his size. It is a pity that we didn't get more of his stories because El was one hell of a Superman villain.
Are you okay?
I'm fine.
Composite Superman. It became evident quite early that someone as powerful as Superman could only be truly challenged by someone exactly like him. This introduced several villainous Superman replicas, and Composite Superman was one of them. He started off as a man named Joseph Meach, who was an unemployed diver. Superman got him a job as a janitor at the Superman Museum, but somehow all his negativity got channeled into anger against the Man of Steel. During one fateful night, lightning struck the statuettes of the Legion of Superheroes, and Joseph was sweeping nearby. This lightning unleashed such an energy blast that Joseph ended up with the powers of all the Legion members. He took up a form that was half Superman, half Batman. And this was the beginning of the supervillain we all know as Composite Superman. He also learned about the secret identities of both Batman and Superman by means of telepathy, but just before their face-off, the powers faded. Later, an alien named Zan restored his powers, and Composite Superman used his shape-shifting abilities to capture Superman by treachery. Eventually, he was defeated by the Man of Steel, but his short stint was surely a memorable one. Ursa. This character was first introduced in the 1978 Superman movie, and Ursa was brought in as one of the assistants of General Zod. She has a strong hate for all men, except for General Zod and Non. She even expresses the desire to kill as many men as possible for her vicious general. She collects items like badges as mementos from the people she kills, and wears them on her uniform. Ursa is one of the rare characters who first appeared in a movie and then got introduced in the comic book lore. She continues to have the same men-bashing tendencies, and Ursa is said to have killed several Kryptonian men in her own concentration camp for men. Of course, such actions bring her to Superman's attention, who has several run-ins with this psychotic young lady. She gets her powers from the sun in the Earth solar system, and she has superhuman abilities that allow her to match up to Superman. She's fast enough to outrun a bullet, and she also has heightened senses. While she's a skilled combatant, Ursa is vulnerable to kryptonite just like other Kryptonians. Some story arcs even establish a romantic angle between General Zod and her, but we mostly remember her for being an iconic Superman adversary. Dominus. Dominus might be a relatively forgotten Superman villain, but those who are familiar with his story arcs will just know how deadly he can be. He has insane time-bending abilities, and the fans often consider him to be among the greatest threats in the DC universe. He was created as an alien priest who also went by the name Tuoni. He appears to have a strong Egyptian influence in his design, and his origin story is one of jealousy and anger. He grows so jealous of his lady love that he starts to use magic to fight her, but this destroys him, and his remains get sent to the Phantom Zone. He is reconfigured as Dominus by one of Superman's ancestors and goes back looking for revenge. This is when he clashes with Superman, and Dominus is able to control the mind of the Man of Steel to use his army of Superman robots and take over the Earth. He also alters the reality for Superman, who starts to believe that he's existing in different realities. Finally, Superman manages to break free from Dominus's mental control, and a psychic tug-of-war sees the alien priest defeated and sent back to the Phantom Zone. It is unfortunate that despite having such incredible powers, Dominus never really makes it big in the DC universe.
Exquisite.
Ultra-Humanite. Ultra-Humanite has some serious historical importance because he was the first supervillain in DC Comics who usually served as an antagonist for Superman. The character was shaped to be the exact opposite of Superman, and although he had a crippled body, his evil genius compensated for his shortcomings. The creators even added a mysterious origin behind Ultra-Humanite, which was never really clarified. He couldn't remember much about his past life and believed that the scientific experiments led to his specialized condition. Ultra-Humanite was paralyzed below his waist, but even on his wheelchair he planned for world domination. During one of his encounters with Superman, the superhero was knocked unconscious by a powerful electricity blast. He even tried killing the Man of Steel while he was unconscious, but all the attempts failed. Finally, Superman was back to his senses and crashed the aircraft which was being used to carry him away. Of course, this was not an end to the menace of the Ultra-Humanite, and he kept coming back, troubling the superhero in various ways. The stories featuring him evolved with time, but his hatred for Superman always remained the same. The Ultra-Humanite had the ability to transfer his brain into another body, and he invented numerous devices to overcome his physical shortcomings. Eradicator. When an ancient Kryptonian weapon is merged with a human body, you get something like the Eradicator. One of Superman's ancestors, Kal-El, created this entity, and its mission was to protect and preserve the purity of Krypton. It was wired to protect the last son of Krypton, and even healed the wounds of Superman.
Does he have to just stand there like that? It's creeping me out.
He's just trying to protect me.
However, when it was brought to Earth, it immediately tried to change the conditions of the planet to turn it into Krypton. Superman was having none of it, and he dumped Eradicator into Antarctica. But it was still functional and continued with its goals of transforming the Earth. During his next interaction with Superman, Eradicator erased his memories, and it took some special effort from a scientist to restore them for the Man of Steel. Superman had to finally head to the Phantom Zone to find a way to stop Eradicator, and finally the threat to Earth was contained. While the Eradicator was extremely powerful with abilities of solar energy absorption, mind control, enhanced vision and strength, it was not necessarily evil. In fact, it was merely acting as it was programmed, and its only purpose was to restore Krypton in some form. Imperix. Imperix was nothing but a form of entropy, pure energy that took a humanoid shape and was protected by a massive armor. The sole purpose of Imperix was to destroy the universe and create new ones, and he'd been doing this since the beginning of existence. He was a force so supreme and evil, even someone like Mongol was prepared to fight alongside Superman to get rid of this menace. Basically, Imperix wanted to eliminate the imperfections of the universe, and since nothing was perfect, he kept destroying and rebuilding it. Superman alone was never enough to fight this superior force, and he got the assistance of several other superheroes and anti-heroes to take down this threat to the planet. Finally, the forces of Earth broke through the armor of Imperix, and it took some special heroics from Superman and the other fighters to save the day. Besides being capable of large-scale energy manipulation, Imperix was capable of creating black holes that were strong enough to suck up an entire universe. He had the power to bring about the Big Bang, and the fact that Superman couldn't take him on by himself goes on to show just how powerful Imperix was. Deathstroke. You know someone's a pure badass when he's regarded as the deadliest assassin in the DC universe. Deathstroke is so lethal that he's regarded as an enemy for several superhero teams, and he's clashed with the likes of Justice League, Teen Titans, and the Titans. He started off as a young man named Wilson, who enlisted in the US Army even though he was underage. He served in Korea, and later he became a major in the Army. However, his stint in Vietnam changed him as a person. He watched the horrors of the war, and later he was subject to a military experiment experiment where a drug was used to give him enhanced abilities. He did become a super soldier, but he no longer followed orders and went rogue. He became a mercenary, but he kept his profession a secret from his wife back home. Of course, a super soldier wasn't going to be enough to stop Superman, but the two did have some interesting fights along the way. His powers were similar to that of Captain America, and he was a great strategist, which allowed him some leverage in his fights with stronger opponents like Superman.
Let him wait. God knows I have.
Maxima, a psycho, superpowered woman who's crazy about Superman and is just about the recipe for a perfect Superman villain, and Maxima did not disappoint. She was an alien queen from a planet named Almerac, and she looked around for a companion on Earth. She wanted one of Earth's finest superheroes to be her husband and the king of Almerac, and she was obsessed with the strongest among them all, Superman. However, when the Man of Steel rejected her proposal, she was enraged and ended up working with the twisted villain Brainiac. Thankfully, better sense prevailed, and she later helped the Justice League to defeat him. She tried her luck on Superman one more time, but the resolve of the superhero could not be broken. Once again, she joined an anti-Superman group and declared war on Superman. They did come to blows briefly, but the Man of Steel eventually appealed to her good side, and she buried her bitterness. She had great control over psionic powers, and she could use her powers to give herself sufficient strength to fight any powerful entity. Overall, she was quite an interesting character, and although she was a Superman villain only momentarily, it was a memorable contest.
And if history has proven anything,
Faora. She is a delightful Kryptonian woman, and much like Ursa, she had a strong hate for all men. She was sentenced to imprisonment in the Phantom Zone for her crimes, where she murdered several men after torturing them, and eventually she ended up working for General Zod. She might seem harmless, but her knowledge of a Kryptonian martial art form makes her dangerous in close combat. She knew all about the pressure points in the body that could be used to her advantage, and she defeated Superman and forced him to flee during their first fight. In a later story arc, Superman used the gold Kryptonite to defeat her, and her last attempt to manipulate the Man of Steel failed. She makes a few comebacks, but the stories featuring Faora never really had her as the central antagonist, which is unfortunate given her powers. She derived her superpowers from the light of the Earth's sun, and she gained almost as much strength as Superman in the process. She was capable of enhanced hearing and vision, and her knowledge of the martial art form named Horukano enabled her to defeat even the Earth's mightiest superhero in hand-to-hand combat. This alluring femme fatale was a Superman villain that we wouldn't forget in a very long time. Jax Er. Jax Er has often been hailed as the worst troublemaker in the Phantom Zone, and for a good reason. He was one of the first criminals who was sentenced to imprisonment in the Zone, and this evil Kryptonian scientist continued his menace even in the confines of the Zone. Jax Er was a fine military general, besides being a great scientist, and it is believed that he had similar powers as Professor Zod. He was charged for the destruction of an inhabited Kryptonian moon during one of his experiments, and he was hardly remorseful for his actions. He made a few successful escape attempts from the Phantom Zone, and his brief stints on Earth saw him fight Superman. He had the usual Kryptonian superpowers, but Jax Er was still not powerful enough to get the better of Superman in conventional combat. However, despite his enmity with the Man of Steel, Jax Er proved that he had a code of honor even as a criminal when he helped Superman fight a deadly alien threat called Black Zero. Fortunately for Superman, this mean villain never got the full extent of his powers during their fights because he was trapped in the Phantom Zone. Otherwise, they would have been evenly matched and made for a greater contest. Conduit, aka Kenny Braverman, had a tragic backstory, much like most other notable villains in the DC universe. When he was being born, he got exposed to extreme kryptonite radiation because the spaceship of Kal-El was passing overhead. He kept getting sick throughout his childhood, but he also made quick recoveries. He grew up to become a great athlete, but he could never beat one of his classmates in school, Clark Kent. You can imagine the rest of the story, can't you? He grew bitter of Clark and developed a high-tech suit to use his superpowers properly. He wore metal gauntlets on his arms that allowed him to shoot out kryptonite radiation, and he tried to attack Clark Kent and Lois Lane. This brought him in direct conflict with Superman, and their rivalry was great to watch because they both had similar powers. He even discovered that Clark Kent was Superman, forcing Clark to go into hiding. Eventually, it all came down to an all-out brawl where Kenny Braverman, or Conduit, was finally defeated. Superman was sad about killing Conduit because he realized that his condition was not really his fault, and it became one of the serious moments in the comic books where there is defeat in victory. Kryptonite Man. His enmity with Superman has been won through the ages. As a child, Kryptonite Kid was an enemy of young Superman, and later he came back once again to fight the fully grown Superman. So, what caused him to get such a strange name? When he was a young boy, he got infused with kryptonite, and his body started to emit the deadly radiation. This got him all his superpowers, and also made him a threat for Superman. Some of his appearances made him look like a green-skinned Superman, and some versions enabled him with the power to take over the bodies of his enemies by infusing them all with the deadly radiation. Another version of Kryptonian Man was a scientist who got infused with kryptonite during one of his experiments. He became Kryptonite Man and fought Supergirl on a few occasions. There is yet another Kryptonite Man who was recruited by Lex Luthor because he hated Superman. He was infused with kryptonite as well and went on to fight the Man of Steel, who eventually defeated him. Apart from his ability to shoot kryptonite radiation and powerful energy blasts, Kryptonite Man also has extreme levels of strength that enables him to match up to someone like Superman himself.
Too bad I have to break you.
Mercy Graves. Those who have watched Superman the animated series will remember Mercy Graves as one of Lex Luthor's trusted assistants and bodyguards. She has a criminal background where she led a gang of female thieves and even stole Lex Luthor's briefcase in a daring heist. Although his men caught her in no time, the evil billionaire scientist was impressed by her capabilities and recruited her. She developed into a loyal and trustworthy soldier for Lex Luthor and ready to put her life in the line for Lex. She came into conflict with Superman and Lois Lane, and an intense fight with the latter saw Mercy receiving a heavy blow that broke her jaw. Superman sometimes tries to convince her about the true evils of Lex Luthor, but she would always turn a blind eye to such advice. Mercy Graves was never shown to have any real superpowers, but she was still a fierce fighter who could trouble Superman and his loved ones by means of her evil schemes. Galactic Golem. This was another of Lex Luthor's twisted creations, and Galactic Golem was simply an artificial entity infused with raw power. He had a humanoid appearance and was built like a giant muscular fighter with massive hands capable of throwing lethal punches. There was so much raw power in him that he could crush the Man of Steel if he so wanted. Galactic Golem had a strange instinct to constantly consume hyperstellar energy, and Lex Luthor used this knowledge to his advantage. He blasted the Man of Steel with this energy, which eventually lured Galactic Golem to find him. The fight between them was a thrilling one, because Superman realized that he would have to pull off a special move to get the better of this menacing villain. During their fight, Superman moved the entire population of Earth to a parallel universe so that the massive explosions of energy didn't harm them in any way. Galactic Golem was finally defeated after Superman kept blasting his weak spot, and this mysterious entity was banished into outer space. The only major weakness that enabled Superman to defeat him was his dependence on hyperstellar energy for his powers. We would have loved for more appearances from this supervillain, but that was not meant to be. Gog. There have been several versions of Gog over the course of time, but the first major variant was a survivor of a nuclear disaster named William. He started to believe that he was omnipotent until Superman burst his bubble and made him mentally unstable. He got his powers after the Quintessence gave him a portion of their own powers, and William became Gog, the dangerous supervillain we know him to be. He thought that Superman was the one responsible for his condition, and in one particular story arc, he even managed to kill the Man of Steel. He was so obsessed with his success over Superman that Gog kept going back in time so that he could kill him again and again. It required a combined effort from all the major DC superheroes to defeat Gog, and this is one villain that Superman couldn't contain by himself. Another version of Gog projects him as a nuclear survivor desperate to turn back time to save his parents who died. His pent-up anger is soon directed towards Superman, and the two engage in a fierce duel. The first version of Gog was probably the most powerful, and he kept getting stronger after absorbing the powers of his opponents. The second Gog was powered more by scientific technology than mystical and magical powers. There is another lesser-known Gog variant who happens to be a god from the third world, and even his powers are infinite. If Superman could be destroyed and toyed around by a handful of villains, Gog would have to be one of them. Atlas. Atlas emerged from a harsh childhood where his parents and his entire clan were killed by the forces of Hisser, the Lizard King. He was then raised by a mysterious traveler named Shagra, who believed Atlas to be one of the survivors of the Crystal Mountain, place where he desired to travel with Atlas's help. Atlas started off as a heroic figure, fighting criminals and protecting innocents, but after King Hisser was defeated, there emerged a dark side to his character. He often came to blows with Superman, and one of the story arcs actually showed him working for a government project that was designed to eliminate Superman. Even as he was almost about to defeat Superman, Krypto, Superman's dog, jumped in to save his best friend. By the time Atlas had cornered Krypto and was about to kill him, Superman stepped in yet again and finally defeated him. This supervillain had the usual superpowers of insane strength and invulnerability, but something about the way he was trained made him an extremely tough opponent. He got the better of Superman during their encounters, and Atlas is easily one of the most underrated Superman villains of all time. Chemo. A scientist named Ramsey Norton used a humanoid plastic vessel to store all the chemical byproducts of his experiments. One day, a failed growth formula was kept in the vessel, and somehow it ended up creating a humanoid life form called Chemo. This violent entity killed the scientist immediately, and it's soon seen in some violent conflicts with the Metal Men. Although Chemo has majorly remained a villain for the Metal Men team, they summoned Superman on one occasion to fight this ruthless supervillain. Chemo has also been used by Lex Luthor and Brainiac, and they treated this mysterious entity as a living weapon that could be used to fuel their purposes. Although Chemo seems to possess superhuman strength and abilities, it doesn't exactly have the smartest thinking capabilities. The limited intelligence means that Chemo is mostly driven by its violent instincts and can be outsmarted by the opponents. However, that does not make it any less dangerous, and in one particular story arc it destroys the alternate universe New York City and kills Aquagirl. We would have loved to see him face more challenges from Superman, but again, that was not meant to be. Titano. Titano is also referred to as the Super Ape, and he's a truly unique character in the long list of Superman rogues gallery. It all started when a small chimpanzee was sent to space as a part of an experiment. It got exposed to certain rays that made it grow to gigantic proportions, and the ape also developed powers like the ones people get from Kryptonite. It came back as a super ape named Titano, and Metropolis suffered the violent wrath of this twisted creature. Superman sorts out the problem, but this version of Titano is portrayed more as a misunderstood creature who simply suffered the consequences of human experimentation gone wrong. Later, another story arc shows the atomic skull corrupting Titano and turning him into a ruthless killer. He had to be contained by Superman yet again, and the character gave us strong King Kong vibes. Besides being super strong physically, Titano could also shoot kryptonite beams from his eyes, which would weaken Superman during a fight. Stories featuring him were rather limited, but we still remember him as one of the iconic Superman villains who impressed even through a brief stint.
Lex, I've told you this. Smallville is your test. Right now you're failing.
Lionel Luthor. Lex Luthor's father has been a subject of curiosity from the moment the character was first created. Some versions of him projected him as someone embarrassed of his son's crimes, while some others show him as utilizing the wealth acquired by Lex Luthor. There are even a few story arcs that suggest that Lex Luthor grew up with an abusive father who eventually died of a heart attack. Recently, the live-action TV series titled Smallville explored further into the character, and we got to see Lionel Luthor, the father of Lex Luthor, back in action. His character in the show goes through a massive transformation, where he starts off as a Superman villain and goes on to become his trusted ally. He even dies while trying to protect Superman's secret identity from his own son. His relationship with his son Lex Luthor is shown to be complicated, and his rivalry with Superman was entertaining while it lasted. Lionel Luthor is certainly not among the deadliest villains that the Man of Steel has to deal with, but his story in Smallville is certainly one of the most touching ones that you'll come across.
It's all right, honey.
Volcana. This curvaceous, innocent-looking, orange-haired young lady might not appear to be dangerous, but Superman, the animated series, introduced her as one of the most shocking villains to trouble the Man of Steel. She was originally a young teenager named Claire Selton who had the power of manipulating fire with her mind. She was sent away to train with her abilities, but a secret government program took her in for some sinister plans. She was renamed Volcana, and she eventually managed to escape from the government agents and became dubbed as a fugitive. She was eventually captured and held captive in a gas tank. Superman arrived to probe into the matter, but when Volcana broke free, she caused numerous explosions in the region. Finally, Superman stationed her on a distant island and kept bringing her food in return for peace. While Volcana could control fire and use it for attacks, she was also vulnerable to asphyxiation because she required oxygen to survive. Although she did have one major face-off with the Man of Steel, she was not necessarily evil and was only a victim of things done to her. Neron. This DC supervillain happens to be a demon lord from hell, and he claims to be one of the first creations of the universe. Just as you would expect from demonic beings, Neron strikes deals with individuals in exchange for their souls. The familiar supervillain Vandal Savage is one of his acquaintances, and he got introduced to the Earth superheroes during the events of Underworld Unleashed. He strikes deals with all the major superheroes, promising them what they desire the most. For instance, he promises to bring Robin back for Batman and Green Lantern's deceased girlfriend in return for his soul. Even some of Earth's supervillains are not spared, and it took some extraordinary efforts to save the day. The demonic entity has clashed with Superman on a few occasions, and mostly the Man of Steel has prevailed. Besides having insane physical strength and speed, Neron can also alter the reality and use his telepathic powers to control individuals. As a demon, he's a master shapeshifter, and he could have been a far greater Superman villain than what the stories allowed. Bloodsport. While there are several versions of Bloodsport in the DC Villains Gallery, one of the most popular ones is Robert Dubois, who suffered from a mental breakdown and became obsessed with the Vietnam War. He wanted to avoid going to the war, but when his brother went instead of him and lost his limbs, Robert suffered from terrible pangs of guilt. Eventually, he was hired by Lex Luthor to assassinate Superman, and the evil scientist equipped Robert with some deadly weapons and technology. He took up the name Bloodsport and slaughtered several innocent civilians before running into Superman. Using a Kryptonite bullet, he severely weakened the Man of Steel, but the superhero fought back, and the two got caught up in a stalemate. Finally, Bloodsport's brother Michael was brought in, and the psychotic killer collapsed from his grief. Bloodsport has later appeared in various story arcs, fighting the likes of Aquaman and Vision. He was eventually imprisoned for his crimes, and it put an end to his menace. There are a couple of other versions of Bloodsport, but they don't really have their individual story arc like Robert Dubois. This version of Bloodsport has no superpowers, but his enhanced fighting abilities and military training make him a deadly adversary for Superman. Prankster. This DC supervillain is a notorious Superman villain who's known for his practical jokes that are evident in his crimes. Originally, Prankster was a man named Oswald Loomis, who had a criminal record and a twisted sense of humor. He's almost a version of the Joker, and he repeatedly troubled Superman even without any apparent superpowers. Prankster used what you would call guerrilla warfare tactics, and attacked using his crooked tactics that often outsmarted Superman. There are a few storylines where Prankster teamed up with Toyman, and the two made life difficult for the Man of Steel. He even got together with the Joker for a few heists together, and he had the nerve to betray someone as cunning and scheming as the Joker. The modern-age Oswald Loomis is presented as a host of a children's show which gets cancelled after the ratings drop. His plans to get revenge on the network are foiled by Superman, and Prankster gives up without a fight because he knows Superman is too strong for him. For an antagonist as powerless as Prankster to trouble Superman as much as he did, this guy surely deserves a special place among the popular Superman villains. Overman. Superman stories never stop teasing our wildest imaginations, and the character of Overman and his backstory is a great example of that. He's basically Superman from an alternate universe who landed in Sudetenland and not in Kansas. Gradually, he became a part of Hitler's forces and even helped the German dictator to win World War II. There was also a blonde, racist version of Overman who was equally violent, but his version as a help for the German forces was the most disturbing story arc. However, his actions made him feel drowned by guilt, and slowly, he realized that what he believed to be duties were actually crimes of the worst kind. His genetic material was seeded with a human child to create Overgirl, and Overman grew extremely fond of her. He had all the powers of Superman because of his Kryptonian physiology, but he also shared the same weaknesses, such as the vulnerability to kryptonite and magic. He didn't come into direct conflict with Superman, and nor was he a villain in the truest sense of the term, but Overman was still one of those characters you wished to see fight against the might of the Man of Steel. Equus. Equus happens to be a gigantic entity that works as one of the pawns of Darkseid, created by one of his minions, an evil scientist named Elias. This biochemist created Equus to serve the Dark Lord, but it was also supposed to boost his own powers. This mysterious entity put the lives of several superheroes in danger and had repeated run-ins with Supergirl and Karate Kid. He fought Superman one time, but the Man of Steel was not the one who dealt the lethal damage to Equus. One of the strong karate chops from Karate Kid severed its arms, and it never really recovered from this severe blow. Equus was powered majorly by his cybernetic appendages, and a synthetic skin above the layers made him appear human-like. He had superhuman strength. enough to test the limits of some of the finest superheroes, and his healing abilities were almost magical in nature. Equus also had deadly claws which could be used to rip through the opponent's skin, as we witnessed during one of his fights with Supergirl. During the events of The Vanishing, where millions of people vanished from the Earth, Superman fought Equus, and the latter managed to slice through Superman's impregnable skin using his talons. Finally, Equus was defeated, but not before he humbled the Man of Steel and gave us an indication of how powerful this supervillain was. Superman Zero. If China can create all the duplicate items in the world, what stops them from replicating Superman? Well, this bizarre question was answered by the introduction of the character named Superman Zero, who was basically a Chinese attempt to recreate the Man of Steel. He was tasked with conquering the entire world, but the Justice League of China, led by the new Superman, stopped him from doing so. While Superman Zero did not fight the traditional Superman as we know him, he did cross swords with a version of Superman. It provided for an exciting contest because Superman Zero had all the powers that Superman possessed. He was enabled with heat vision, super breath, extreme strength, stamina, and speed, and he also had the power of flight. However, he was also vulnerable to kryptonite just like Superman, and this was used to bring about his downfall. Superman Zero may have been one of the obscure Superman villains, but his story demands your attention simply for the uniqueness of the idea. Adversary. When you think about the deadliest Superman villains, a wheelchair-bound boy hardly comes to mind. That is, unless you know about the young boy named Carrie Richards, who used to be Clark Kent's next-door neighbor. He was powerless and crippled until he struck a deal with a demon named Saturnus. This granted him psionic powers and removed his apparent weaknesses. Soon, he was an enemy that Superman couldn't contain easily, and he took up the name Adversary. To be fair to him, the poor boy was manipulated by Saturnus, but that didn't stop him from turning into a powerful villain with psychokinetic powers. He even kidnapped Lex Luthor, and it brought a direct conflict between Adversary and Superman. The Man of Steel got the better of him, and Carrie Richards retreated and vanished mysteriously. It was painful to watch a good-hearted kid turn into a psychopath, but Adversary was just as dangerous as some of the deadliest Superman villains that you'll come across. Amalak. Here is another rogue alien entity to add to Superman's long line of alien adversaries. Amalak lived in a planet that was destroyed by the expansion of Krypton, and he made it a point to destroy all Kryptonians as his revenge. He came over to Earth to attack Superman and any other surviving Kryptonian, but he did not succeed in his efforts. Amalak was imprisoned by the interstellar authorities, and his revenge remained incomplete. He could have posed a more serious threat than what the story arcs allowed because the alien supervillain had all the powers to trouble the Man of Steel. He could even emit red sun radiation and kryptonite radiation, which could weaken Superman in a serious duel. Auctioneer. Just as his name suggests, Auctioneer was a specialist in intergalactic trade. This alien entity had an army of evil robots and used his forces to rob all the valuables of a planet. He would then proceed to sell them all, and his transactions were the focus of his attention more than any other evil purpose. When he arrived on Earth, he started to steal the remarkable landmarks, and eventually Superman was forced to try and stop him. The auctioneer was fascinated by Superman and found him to be unique enough to be a part of his collection. He also fancied the Teen Titans to go with the Man of Steel and planned to steal them all to make a fortune. Unfortunately, the plan never worked out because Superman and the other superheroes like Livewire and Nightwing got together to force the alien thief out of Earth. The auctioneer was extremely powerful, and he could withstand bullets and missiles fired at him effortlessly. His alien physiology made him near invulnerable, but Superman did find a way to get the better of him eventually. Baron Sunday. Of all the dangerous things that Superman had to endure, you didn't think voodoo would be in the list, did you? Well, the Man of Steel did have to withstand some dark magical forces when he clashed with Baron Sunday, the infamous crime lord of Metropolis. And it was partly because Superman was already weakened from a previous fight. Eventually, Baron Sunday was defeated by Gangbuster, who saved Superman a whole lot of trouble. Colonel Future. He was a regular guy named Colonel Edmund Hamilton, a prominent NASA scientist who got electrocuted accidentally. After this event, he started to have visions of the future, and he saw the Earth being destroyed in a dangerous solar flare in the next 2 weeks. This is when he developed the costume and equipment for Colonel Future, and did everything in his capacity to divert the solar flare. What he didn't know was that the flare was being caused by Superman, who was engaged with the task of destroying a rogue asteroid. And this led to a brief tussle between the two. Colonel Future, however, was not exactly evil, and he later reconciled with the Man of Steel. While the man could see the future, he could only have these visions when his life was in grave danger. He was last seen delivering a speech about the responsible use of powers because misuse could prove to be disastrous. Mr. Z. This immortal enemy of Superman troubled the Man of Steel time and again, and the superhero often fell short of keeping him at bay. When he first met Superman, Mr. Z claimed that he knew the superhero from the days dating back to the Second World War, and he was puzzled by this revelation. Mr. Z had a twisted hobby, where he collected the souls of individuals and stored them in a gem set in the handle of his cane. However, he failed to get Superman's soul because of his alien origins. The power of his soul overloaded the stone, and it exploded, seemingly killing Mr. Z. Later, he woke up in a morgue and managed to escape. The sinister supervillain kept coming back for more duels with Superman, but finally the Man of Steel destroyed his special equipment that enabled him to fight. In one of the story arcs, Mr. Z actually managed to make Superman lose his memory, but the other superheroes were able to rescue him, and Mr. Z got stuck in an abandoned island forever. He's easily among the creepiest Superman villains that you'll encounter, even though he's not among the most powerful ones. These are all the supervillains that Superman ever encountered, and the only names we might have left out were either too inconsequential or never engaged in a direct conflict with the Man of Steel. Do let us know in the comments below about your favorite Superman villain, and also tell us about the ones you hated the most. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.